So what we're going to do is this is actually divided into several different sections. So we're going to go through kind of some of the basic things about remote supports just to lay the groundwork. We're going to talk about how to prepare and set goals for the implementation of remote supports. We'll talk about implementation best practices, and then also how to, once you've implemented remote supports for some of the people that you're serving, how to continue to support that to ensure success. So I want to start with a story, and I'm going to try to keep this pretty brief, and there's several slides. I'm just not going to go through them. But this is a woman that I had the chance to serve. She lives up in Maine. Obviously, names have been changed. She was in her mid-20s, early 20s, and lived with her mom most of her life, and was at that point in her life where she really wanted to move out. And as she, sorry, I'm going to have to admit people here, her and her mother were, she was in the waiver system up in Maine, and as her and her mother were looking for, living situations, they found basically a group home where she could go live with 3 other women. She moved in. It was great to get out of her house, but she didn't really like that, kind of like congregate living thing. She really wanted to live on her own in her own home. Talking to the case manager, she just didn't have the budget to do that, to get the staff supports that she needed, which were 24/7, and she has pretty severe anxiety and some physical challenges that do require, lots of hand-over-hand assistance and that kind of thing. But she just didn't have the budget to go live by herself and to get the staff support that she needed. So her mental health was significantly declining because she just did not like her living situation whatsoever. Mom reached out to the case manager, her case manager up there in Maine, who had luckily been at a tech conference that the state of Maine had done and had heard about this remote supports thing. And they kind of started thinking about it and talking to some vendors. And luckily they picked the company that I worked for. And we were actually able to get her moved out into her own home with remote supports being provided 10 hours overnight when those hands-on type needs weren't needed, but we were there to assist her with various things throughout the evening to calm her if she became anxious because she was alone. She could have face-to-face conversations with us. And then she had staff coming in during the day. So it really, the mother was extremely excited about this. Her daughter was able to, kind of get out on her own, start living on her own, and has actually flourished in some other areas of her life outside of that. So it's a pretty simple story, but kind of just highlights what remote supports can do for individuals, helping them to live the life that they really want. So one of the things that I always like to say that when we're talking about remote supports, this isn't about technology. Yes, you have to use technology when you're providing remote supports, but I really see remote supports as more of a human to a human service. It's a human being on one end providing supports to another human being. It just happens that technology has put it kind of in the middle there to connect those two people. But this is not a technology service per se. It's truly just a different way of providing support, direct care. So I think we as an industry have to kind of fundamentally start to rethink, as tech becomes a bigger part of everything that we're doing, fundamentally rethink, how do we define support for someone? In the past, support was typically defined as, a caregiver. Caregiver equals support, right? Or job coach equals support, or et cetera. We have to kind of fundamentally think about that. And when we're doing remote supports, we shouldn't, again, be focused on the technology. We should really always be looking at the needs, preferences, and desires of the person first. If we start with that approach instead of, hey, this company's got this great device that can do this type of approach, we're going to find a much better solution that's going to work better for everyone. There's lots of benefits of remote supports for the person being served, the empowerment, the independence, another choice in service. For the service agency that is, the local agency that's providing services to that individual, having this tool to increase independence of the people that you're serving, as well as, you're able to have remote supports be provided in a handful of homes, and you can remove, those staff during those times and reallocate them to other open positions within your agency to help address workforce issues and workforce shortages. And I really do feel pretty strongly that this is kind of the next phase in community living, remote supports as a part of the enabling technology movement. So when we first start doing this, again, looking at the goals, the possibilities, the desires, the limitations and the risks, et cetera, for the person, keep in mind, it's not about technology, that we need to bend the technology to meet that individual's, personal goals, and focusing on those outcomes first. That is the most important. So I wanted to start with, for those of you that may not be extremely familiar with this, what is remote supports and what it is not. So the next slide, we should have a graphic that kind of shows you a hypothetical situation of how remote supports are provided. We have the individual's home over here with a variety of different devices throughout the home. And we're going to talk a little bit about those device types later on, but we don't really want to get too focused on devices yet. So, but the individual living in their home is connected through these devices. The information is sent to a remote caregiver who can intervene, provide supportive prompting, cueing, coaching, monitor for falls, assist with medication administration, a variety of different things. So we're going to talk about that. In addition to the remote caregiver, there will be times when these individuals will need some physical assistance that this remote person can't do. And that's when a local backup person can be called and sent out to the home to provide supports to that individual. And we're going to talk about some of the backup support models here in just a minute. So some of the devices that we're seeing with many of the remote support vendors that are in the market today, some use cameras, some don't. Most of the remote support providers that do use cameras are pretty adamant that they're only used in the common areas of the home for obvious reasons. We don't want them in bedrooms or bathrooms. Almost all of the remote support systems have two-way audio communication. Some have two-way audio and two-way video, so kind of like we're doing today. Door and window sensors, motion detectors, smoke detectors, call buttons. We're seeing bed sensors, water flow sensors for showers, and toilets that are flushing. And, I think that we're going to see this expand pretty quickly into more of a medical model as well, where you can have like a blood pressure cuff or a glucometer or something of that nature tied into the system. The another key piece in this model is that this remote caregiver is not just some distant, cold person that knows nothing about the person that they're serving. For remote supports to really work right, there has to be a plan. So we talk a lot about a tech plan in Shift, and the remote support vendor that you pick should help you develop a remote support plan on how this remote caregiver will provide supports to this person, so that this person really does get to know those intimate details about the person that they're serving and can provide that individualized service. And then, the third piece here, and we're going to talk about this more, so I'm not going to, spend too much time on this, but, picking the correct local backup situation is going to be important. Having several tiers of responders, because I can tell you the number of times when at the agency that I was running that we were, calling local backup, I would say at least 20 to 30% of the time they were not responding, and we had to go to that second tier. So to kind of summarize this, remote supports is provided by an RSP, remote support professional. I don't know if that's a term that's going to stick, but I just kind of made it up. Makes sense to me because, DSP, RSP. So it is support provided by a person through technologies that person is trained on their needs, and then you have that local backup person available as necessary. It is not assistive technology in the traditional sense. So assistive technology is defined as a piece of tech that improves some form of functional capability for the individual. So assistive technology is a device that the person is using, whether it's a tablet or a communication device or AirPods to help them hear their phone better, whatever. It's a piece of tech that they are using. Remote supports, typically most of those devices, the individual does not use. They're just a means to connect them to a remote person. So remote supports doesn't really fit in that traditional assistive technology kind of service definition. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, to be determined, I guess, many states right now that are funding remote supports have plugged it into an AT service definition, which makes it a little it's not optimal. Let's just leave it at that. But we are seeing many states that are funding remote supports as well. Remote supports is not, your typical personal emergency response buttons, the help, I've fallen and I can't get up. It is the next generation, I guess, of that service. But it should never be used just as a PERS device. It's not the absence of a caregiver. It's actually the addition. It's two caregivers. You're going from one person in the home, a staff person in the home, to two people supporting the individual. So you're actually getting more people supporting the person, but you're just doing it in a more efficient way. And it's also not a substitution for human connection. And it should never be. When I was at ShiftRSEdited, is the company that I ran for many years. And when I was there, we had some people come to us and say, hey, we think this person can have remote supports 24 hours a day. And I'm like, you can't do that. I mean, you have to have staff involved in that person's life, natural supports involved in that person's life. And remote supports should not be used to substitute those things. It should be used to provide support during the less active times so that you can increase support around those other areas of that person's life to start to create more human connection. So it should never be viewed as a substitute for human connection. And we've kind of hit this pretty hard already. Remote supports we've talked about this, a human supporting another human in real time. And that is kind of one of the fundamental things in most state waiver service definitions. This does need to be done in real time. So it can't just be technology that's logging activities for review later. Those kinds of things may be great for the person, but that doesn't really qualify as remote supports because the person needs to be receiving those alerts. The remote caregiver needs to be receiving those alerts in real time. It always needs to be individualized to both the way that the service is provided, but also the technology that is used dependent upon that person's needs. You should never call a remote support provider and get an answer that says, yes, our system includes this, 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 and this in every home. It's not the right approach. It's not that you can't cookie cutter this and make it really work for that person. It has to be individualized. And it really only should be used to provide support to people. And most state waivers do spell this out very clearly, that you cannot use remote supports as a staff monitoring tool. I'm fairly certain that it's happening, but they will not pay you for that. So I kind of hit on this a little bit. I'm gonna move beyond this. Basically, the big difference between assistive technology and remote supports is that the individual uses technology to improve functional capabilities with assistive technology, and remote supports is a human to a human service. So what are some of the benefits of using remote supports? Obviously, you can read down the left-hand side of the screen there. And those things are all great. We talked about no roommate, living in my own place, the feeling of independence and the dignity. When I was at ShiftRSEdited, and I wasn't even planning on doing this, but when I was at ShiftRSEdited and I was doing my ShiftRSEdited sales pitch, right, talking about how we do remote support, there was always a story that I told that just was always stuck in my mind, and it just came up, so I'm going to tell it. It was 2007, and we had just started providing services, and I was to this group of people down in southern Indiana, and I was down at a workshop going to a team meeting, and I was just kind of standing there waiting on another group to get out of the meeting room, and I was in the workshop and I could see people working, and just felt this person come up behind me and put his arm around me. And I looked over, and it was the guy that we just started providing remote supports to, a few months ago. And he goes, "Hey, you're the camera guy." That's how he saw me. And I said, "Yeah, I guess that's me." And I said, "How are things going for you?" And he said, "Oh, good." He's like, "It's amazing. I can sit on my couch in my underwear and hold the remote control in my hand to change the television." And it just, having been a DSP and worked at a provider organization, just stuck with me. Like, we're allowing people to do things that they never thought that they would be able to do, even something as simple as sitting in your underwear in your house. Bad example, I know, but I can't resist telling that story. It just kind of struck me so hard, I guess. So lots of benefits for the person being supported. For provider agencies, it's a way for you guys to meet a new way to meet goals and outcomes in an ISP in a different way. Obviously, one of the bigger benefits is the reduction on and reliance on your direct support professionals. And we can talk about reducing costs and increasing margins, but that's great because lots of you do run businesses, and that is an important aspect of managing that business so that you can keep providing services to the people that you're serving. And there's cost savings kind of all over the board with remote supports, from labor expenses to kind of some of those intangible things that we haven't really been able to measure yet, like overtime reduction, turnover reduction. If you're doing remote supports yourself, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit, a career path for your DSP. So they can start as a DSP and then maybe become a remote, an RSP. So there are many, many benefits for service provider organizations. For families, this is just the story that I told at the beginning of this presentation up in Maine. That mother, the only way that her daughter was going to be able to live by herself and get the support that she needed without remote supports would have been mom doing the overnight shift at her house. And her mom was considering it, and which meant that mom would probably have to quit her job, which would have totally just destroyed her mother's life. So there are those kind of other benefits to family members as well. And just watching their son or daughter grow and become more independent. One of the benefits that you saw in the person slide, benefits to the person, and I didn't talk about it, was empowerment in other areas of their life. So we've seen many, many stories, and there's research studies from Ohio State University who've shown that individuals, once they have that taste of autonomy and empowerment of I'm in my own home, I'm in my underwear on my couch, that translates into other aspects of their life, and they're better able to advocate for themselves and expand their capabilities in other areas of their life. For service coordinators, case managers, again, it's another tool. It's another choice. Right now, as a service coordinator, when you walk into a meeting, and I don't know, we probably don't have any service coordinators on here today, but they walk into a meeting, somebody that just gets a waiver, and they say, hey, you can pick provider A, provider B, provider C, but they all do the same thing. And now this is another option, another choice that you can present in a team meeting, along with all of the other amazing enabling technologies that we're seeing. So the thing I don't want to do is to let's take my sales hat off from my past job. I don't want to be perceived like that. Remote supports are great and amazing, and they can be done, very easily, but it's not going to work for everybody. And there are definitely some risks and limitations to this. So we need to talk about those. The first one being, obviously, this service is not for everybody. It was never designed. Who knows what technology is going to be like in the future, but I don't see it ever working for everyone. Some things to consider, and kind of some of the lines that I always used to use when I was at Rest Assured was, if that person is going to be a risk to themselves or someone else, if there's no caregiver physically present within a seconds response time, then that person's probably not going to be appropriate for remote supports. You also need to be thinking about technical limitations and issues. So what happens when something breaks? Is that person going to be vulnerable during a short outage window because of an internet hiccup or a power blip or whatever it is? And then also your backup responders. How quickly can they get to the home is something that the team needs to be considering, because maybe the person is okay to be alone if there's a technical issue. They wouldn't be a risk to themselves for 5 minutes, but we wouldn't want them to be there for 20 minutes because of some medical condition, a seizure disorder, whatever it is. That so makes talking about the backup responders and how quickly they can get to that individual's home is going to be important, and making sure you set those up the right way, and also making sure they're reliable, because like I said, when we placed calls to backup people 20-30% of the time, we didn't get an answer on the first call. For the remote support caregivers, some things to consider, kind of that, within a second or arm's reach support level. If that person's going to require somebody to be within an arm's length of them to be able to provide hands-on redirection, whatever assistance, may not be the appropriate person for that. Another thing to consider, are monitoring ratios. So as you're, and I think I talk about this more later, but as you're looking at vendors for remote supports and the team is talking about this with them, ask this question: what are your ratios? And the number that they give you shouldn't be really what you're going after. So I could walk in and talk to a remote support vendor and say, what are your numbers? Oh, we have 1 caregiver to 10 homes. Oh, okay, that's crazy. And then the next one comes in and, well, it's more about 1 to 80. And that's, so those numbers aren't a reflection on which agency is going to be better. What you should be asking them immediately after that is, how do you manage those monitoring ratios? And if it's just kind of like, well, we make sure that all the responses are done and we, train our caregivers so they're really good, it's not a good response. What you're going to want is that they've got analytics and data and to show that all of the needs of the people that they're serving are being met. So the agency that's doing 1 to 10 ratio may not have that data and may just be kind of winging it. And the agency that's got the 1 to 80 ratio may have all kinds of data to show that everybody's needs are being met, alerts are being responded to, and that kind of thing. So just something to keep in mind as you're looking at this. The number isn't important. The response on how they manage that number is what's really important. And also, what safeguards are going to be in place to avoid human errors while providing remote supports is another great example of something that you should be thinking about as you're looking at remote support vendors. Do they have cameras on the people watching the cameras? Do they have, how is their system built to ensure that an alert coming in doesn't get missed? How quickly can they, provide repairs and things of that nature and fix technical issues that are going to occur? All good things that you really need to be thinking about. Another thing that you need to think about is, if your agency has, let's say you're using remote support vendor ABC, and they're providing services to 10 of your homes, and you've got 15 individuals living in those 10 homes. And you've taken those staff and put them in other open positions within your organization. Well, what happens if a hurricane comes through and knocks out power for days? What happens if a tornado comes, or there's what I'm saying? Those big acts of God situations that have the capability of taking the remote support service down for an extended period of time. How is your agency going to plan to cover those 10 homes that you don't have staff for? So just something to kind of think about. We also need to be making sure that we're looking at how the remote support vendor does routine maintenance and monitoring the status of the system. Meaning, they have a protocol on how fast or when they go out to change batteries or check wiring, et cetera, and then how are they monitoring the status of the health of the system in real time? And then also, adaptability of future tech. If they're an organization that has a system and this is our system and we're not changing, and we don't plan on adding any telehealth or anything else in the future, something that you would probably want to look at, because the person that gets the services from them, they're not stagnant. They're going to be changing. Their needs may change as they get older and might need a medical component to remote support. And having to switch remote support vendors later on in life is not, it would be much easier if you had a vendor that could do all of that right out of the gate. Okay, so backup responders. You can read the stuff on the screen, but I mostly just want to talk about the different models that I've seen used. The most popular, honestly, is for an agency that has several homes that are receiving remote supports. It's typically the local service provider that is that backup person, unless the family, lives nearby, or there's a neighbor or friend or something like that that can be the backup person. It can be a natural support like that, but by and large, most of the time, it's an employee of the local service provider. And in most situations, when people first start out with 2, 3, 4 homes, the typical go-to is like the administrator that's on call already, right? I'm sure your agency has an on-call rotation of some sort. That person could be the on-call, but then you have to be thinking about the location of the homes and How quickly can they get to those homes based on where they live or where they're on call? So then we've seen agencies that that don't feel that that model is going to work for them very well because of distances or whatever. So they may actually have a backup person stationed in one of the homes that is receiving remote supports. So it's kind of like, the staff person is either awake or sleeping in one of the homes that's receiving remote supports, and then can leave, be dispatched from that home to get out to the other home. So we've seen that done as well. I've seen agencies pay a small stipend to a DSP that lives nearby. And I'm not an attorney and I don't know the labor laws, but so that, be careful with that one, because if that person is on call in their home, you just be careful with that. But I've seen it done. I've also seen it done where in some of the larger homes where there are 2 staff in a home, where they will actually replace one staff with remote supports and leave one staff there. And then the remote support person is kind of playing air traffic control for the other staff person in the home, or as that staff person goes in to assist with bathing, grooming, et cetera, in the bathroom, then you still got that other remote caregiver that's observing everything else in the common areas of the home and probably doing it better because they can be in all places at once instead of that other staff person who may be assisting somebody in the kitchen and what's happening in the living room, right? I worked in a group home once and it was, so yeah, let's leave it at that. Okay, so what are we seeing remote supports being used for? Obviously, there are no 2 use cases the same because there's no 2 people that are the same. When we implemented well over 1,000 remote homes of remote supports, went with a company that I was with, and I can tell you that there was never 2 identical care plans or 2 identical system setups. They were all different and customized to that person's unique needs and preferences. But some of the things that we're seeing, and some of the common big ones, general oversight of health and safety, making sure Bob doesn't get up in the middle of the night and fall, or being there if he does, making sure that nobody comes into the home, making sure that if Sally goes to use the stove, whatever, that you're observing and coaching and making sure that that meal prep is done right. Assisting with medications is a big one. Including an automated medication dispenser as a piece of enabling technology with remote supports is a pretty powerful way to address med administration. You've got the device that's going to only give the person the right drugs. You've got a camera where you can actually see the person get that last, the last, I guess, foot from the device to the mouth. So it's just a great combination, and med administration or med reminders is a big thing. Dietary compliance is one. I can remember, it's just a funny story. Our caregivers at the agency that I was running, for this one guy, he was a diabetic, and he was very, very independent, but didn't always like to follow the diet that he was supposed to be on. And he would get himself up in the morning. He would make sure that he was, getting his personal hygiene done and making sure that he was getting his lunch packed for work. And then he would go catch the bus to go to work. And one of the days, our caregivers was watching him pack his lunch and kind of noticed that he had 2 cabinets open and was trying to kind of be a little sneaky about it. And he ended up getting like 4 Twinkies and 3 Diet Cokes in his lunchbox. And our caregiver prompted him and said, "Hey, are you supposed to have that?" And he's like, "Yeah." She's like, "Well, maybe you should put some of those Twinkies away and get something else," that kind of thing. Just assistance around those life decisions beyond dietary compliance. Movement and activities in a specific area of the home. Is Bob in bed or is Bob out of bed? Is Sally in the bathroom? Is she standing in front of the sink or is she standing in front of the toilet? That kind of thing. Ensuring visitor safety, helping that individual make appropriate choices on who they should be letting in and who they shouldn't. A lot of people that would be served don't know a stranger, right? And everybody's their friend. So how can we use remote supports to ensure safety with visitors, but also ensuring that person has visitors? Detection of elopements, and remote supports is actually really great at the prevention of elopement. So instead of just getting that door sensor going off and saying, Bob's already gone and out the door and running through the backyard, with remote support, you can set it up in a way that you can get red flags that an elopement may be occurring, right? So in the middle of the night, Bob, instead of getting up and going towards the bathroom, he goes down the hallway the other way. You're gonna have a motion sensor there, which is an alert to the caregiver, hey, he's going towards the door, right? And then they can kick the two-way audio on. Prompting, coaching through ADLs, and that's obviously going to be very, very person specific on what do they need help with. And something that I hadn't planned on talking about, but that I saw the other day that I'm kind of really excited about is, we've all seen these forms of enabling technology that can be run on an iPad or something of that nature that prompt an individual through activities of daily living, with pictures and verbal instructions given to them, and helping them to follow step-by-step instructions to complete certain activities of daily living. Well, that also occurs with remote support, but it's the remote caregiver that's doing that prompting through all of those steps, which takes their remote caregiver's attention away from kind of what the other homes that they're serving, right? So what if, and I'm hoping somebody does this, the remote support company could incorporate some of those ADL prompting type things, on an iPad that the individual's using, and they're sitting here going through it, and they get stuck, and then that prompting system pushes an alert out to the remote caregiver, and the remote caregiver just kind of pops up on the screen here and says, hey, I see you're not, do you have questions about how to cut the onions or that kind of thing? Could be pretty powerful. There's the business idea for you guys. And one of the big ones that I think gets overlooked, because immediately when we start talking about remote supports in this industry, what the first thing we do, because we're trained to do this, is how are we going to keep this person safe? And that's good. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but we forget about this social part. Like, how can we encourage social interaction through the remote support system, either to the remote caregiver or to peers or to other people of that nature? And then, obviously, the person can hit a button and get, assistance. We see remote supports being used at various different times throughout the day. Most of the time, it's a pretty set schedule, like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. every day. However, we have seen it done where, it's just a few hours in the morning to fill that, tough to fill shift, just to go over and make sure Bob's got his lunch packed and has taken his medicine before he goes to work. We've seen it done in a variety of different ways, but so it's, you have to be, as a team, you need to be thinking about when is the appropriate time to do remote supports. And I would really recommend that you start with maybe the most passive time for that individual, and then you can increase the number of hours once you see how the person responds to the service and that kind of thing. And I've already talked about, kind of the second staff model of remote supports plus on-site caregiver. Okay, any questions out there? I haven't looked at the chat yet, but if anybody has a question, I'm gonna take a drink. Feel free to, jump on here and ask any questions you have.
Hey, Dustin, this is Milton. I just wanted to comment on your suggestion about using those task prompting applications and providing remote support using those. We are actually doing that in some situations in Tennessee. And not only while people are at home, but we're also exploring some of those applications, those real-time like Wayfinder applications that could send alerts to remote support people that somebody got off their route while taking public transportation in the community. And then also at places of employment in which a person would have a tablet with tasks that need to be done within a certain time period. And if they're not done, a notification goes to the remote support job coach that then contacts them and makes sure that they are able to complete the task successfully. So
that's awesome. So it's kind of like remote supports, but outside of the home. Even you could take it outside
Yes.
of the home. So it's remote supports in the community, remote supports at work, remote supports while using public transportation. That's cool.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just dive back into this. and I almost promise you we will not get through this whole thing today in this hour, but again, you're going to have access to the whole thing, so the whole deck. So there's a variety of different ways, and Milton actually just kind of started talking about some of the different ways that remote supports can be provided. But in the home, what I've seen is there are really kind of these fundamental ways in which remote supports are being done. The first is what I call active support, and that is real-time support using cameras, sensors, two-way audio. Caregiver is watching everything that's happening in the home, responding to alerts as they occur, jumping in and interacting with the person kind of whenever they see that it's needed. But it's eyes on, ears on, response when needed. A different variant on that is what I call active on demand. And it's just, all of these are remote supports, but just different ways of describing the different ways these systems can be used. In these situations, maybe you have a camera in the home, but the person in the living room or maybe looking at the front door, but the person doesn't want them on all the time. They want some privacy. So you set a system up in such a way that a sensor will indicate that something is occurring in a home that the team has already talked about. And when that happens, then turn the camera on and do your active support type thing. So it's just a way for that person to get, a little bit more privacy, but still have that safety net of having a camera there. And, we didn't really talk much about the cameras in the past slide. So I think I'll just kind of hit on that here real quick, that the perception of cameras has changed drastically from when we started this in 2006 to today. You're not going to get as much pushback, but you will. And rightfully so. Some people are just not going to want that. And that needs to be their choice. Again, keeping that person's needs, choices, preferences in the center of how we design these things. So as a team, you need to be talking through, like, is it okay if we don't have a camera? Because cameras do give that remote caregiver so much more capability that you're just not going to have without a camera. So it's kind of a thing of weighing, privacy versus health and safety, and trying to find the sweet spot in the middle that really works. So another way that we've seen this done is kind of some scheduled check-ins. Turn the system on every night at 5:00 p.m. to give Bob the medication reminder, or watch during meal prep, whatever it is. And then also some kind of random check-ins. So, hey, just pop in sometime between 8 p.m. and midnight and make sure that he's there and everything is good and he's, had his medications, whatever it is. So what I usually like to do is to recommend that people don't, swing for the fences right out of the gate when you do this. You can start slowly with remote support. And the sweet spot, I think, to start slowly is to look at what is the scope of things we can use remote supports for. Well, we could use it for helping him prepare a meal, or we could use it for helping him make sure visitors don't come in, or whatever. But when should we be using it? We really think we should probably only use it overnight, right? So the overnight time is more in this area. Daytime would be here, but the daytime, and then what's the preference of the person? And as those things start to overlap, you'll kind of find a good starting spot for remote supports. And you can start very small with just a few kind of use cases or a few things that the system is being used to address during a very limited amount of time in a very limited way, and then expand into different ways that the system can be used, which might allow you to use it for more in the future. So just a way that I like to kind of look at that. So believe it or not, we're 45 minutes into this thing and we're only at section 2 and there's 4 sections. But again, we're not going to get through the whole thing, but I do want to hit on this preparing goals section here. And actually, you know what, let me kind of skip through this. So what I am trying to do on these slides is to give you a framework on how to work with the team to come to a consensus on where that sweet spot is and how a remote support is going to be used. and you obviously, you guys know the team process, so I can move through this pretty quickly. We have to be looking at, when we do remote supports, you have to look at all of these. And it's going to sound contrary to a person-centered approach, but that's not at all what I'm insinuating. I'm just saying that you have to be thinking about all of these things. How is this going to affect the provider agency? How is this going to affect the family? And the person, obviously? I don't want to, and start kind of somewhere where everybody's kind of in agreement is what I would, again, recommend. So where are our preferences? Where are our goals overlapping? But, I don't want to ever make us keep this, forget this part, because we have to keep the person front and center. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if we don't think about those other people's goals and desires for the person, then we may not set remote supports up in the ideal way. But we have to, I'm not sure if I'm doing a very good job in communicating this, but I'm not suggesting that you do this in a non-person centered way. I'm suggesting that you take into account how remote supports are going to affect the team, because they will, especially in provider situation, right? Financially, contracts, those kinds of things. Okay, so the first thing that I would do if I were you guys is when you're looking at providing remote supports to someone is in a team setting, sit down and look at the ISP, make sure that it's still accurate, that the goals and desires and objectives that are outlined in there and needs are still accurate. Look at if you have a high risk plan, something of that nature. Look at service documentation and incident reports, any other data that you have from an EHR or those kinds of things, and really get data, because I think we will occasionally not look at the data and just kind of go with a gut instinct, on some things. And if we really, because this incident that happened 4 years ago, that could happen again. We shouldn't do this. But okay, well, let's look at the data on those types of incidents that Bob has had. He had 5, 10 years ago. He had 1 4 years ago. Well, let's talk about that. So I just want people to look at like real data. There are several great assessment tools out there. We have one included in Shift that you can use to have these to help guide the conversation within the team. There's another really great one that is, and there's a link here to this. ARM is the Minnesota Provider Trade Association. They've got a technology resource center website that they've got some really great assessment tools for remote supports. Then you, as a team, and as a provider agency, this is a big area. And I think I'll probably end after this section just to kind of see what questions you guys have and just kind of talk in general. To do remote supports, you can go to a remote support vendor and hire, a Rest Assured, a Safe and Home, a Syngistics, a Night Owl, etc., and go with the pros. They will guide you through the process of setting goals, creating a remote support plan, evaluating the home, designing the equipment, setting up the equipment, installing the equipment, supporting the equipment, helping you to design that local backup response plan, right? And then they do all of the monitoring. Obviously, in that situation, you as the local service provider may be contracting with that agency for those services. And then you are paid through the waiver for reimbursement for the remote support services in one way or another. If you do decide to go that way, that's great. And they do an amazing job. But their tech has changed over the last 15 years. And 15 years ago, to go out and try to set up a remote support system would have been extremely challenging. And it still is today. And it's extremely expensive and time consuming. But you can go out and do DIY types of solutions where maybe your agency doesn't need to build a whole remote support platform. You can get a bunch of tablets and hang them on a wall in all the homes and have them backed up by battery, and maybe even tie in some smart home type stuff, and set up your own remote support service line where you're doing it yourself. And actually, I think that that's an amazing model, because the thing that the remote support vendors won't tell you, and I was one, and I didn't, is that there is a difference between knowing somebody on a care plan that you see and reading it on a screen and meeting that person every night through video chat versus being the local service provider that is involved in their community, knows who their friends are, knows if their staffing schedule changed last week, knows if that person had a good day or a bad day at work today. So there is some power in the local service provider providing remote support. The challenge with it is what you're going to find is that if you want to go out and build a very robust remote support system that is tailored and has a simple user interface that your local remote caregiver can use without having to bounce from Ring video doorbell application, have that open, and then have your Amazon Alexa sensor alerts coming in here, and then, oh, I need to move that around because I can't see this. What you're going to end up having is, as you start to package together these different kinds of tech, you'll find that these different techs are all built in silos. So the Google stuff won't talk to the Apple stuff, the et cetera, and you'll have this kind of spaghetti framework of a remote support system that will not be optimized to allow you to ensure health and safety and doing it in the best way. The other option is to go out and build it yourself, to design something from scratch, which is going to mean you're hiring software developers to write custom code, and it's going to be extremely expensive. I was actually talking to a remote support vendor the other day, and they've dumped well over $1 million into building their system and have an outlay of what was it, $100,000 every year for just operating the software that they're using, and another $100,000 in tweaking the system with software development. So it's going to be expensive, but don't let that kind of change your mind. Start small. Like we said, using a tablet, using Ring video doorbells, whatever it is that you want to use, and you can do it yourself. So where can you find remote support vendors? Well, one, Disability Cocoon is a great resource, the company that I own. Shift is a great place to do that. Everything that we've done at Disability Cocoon is now archived in Shift in those kind of supplemental learning courses that you guys can see. There's probably 100 of them in there. Going and talking to your local provider or case manager, state entity. So lots of different ways that you can find them. So after you, and we kind of talked a little bit about this, after you find a vendor or make that decision to, did we go DIY? Are we going DIY or are we going pro? Maybe it's a mix. Either way, at some point you may need to go find a vendor. First I would just, kind of kick the tires, looking at their sites and asking them for some information, meet them and get demos of their systems. And then once you kind of bring your goals that we talked about from before, and maybe we didn't talk enough about that, but the goals that your agency has with using remote supports, the goals of some of the people that you think might be appropriate for remote supports. What are their needs? What are the things you're going to have to address? Bring that stuff to those meetings and say, can you do this? Can you do that? Can you not do this? So that you're picking a vendor that's going to be able to meet most of the needs of people that you're serving. And you don't have to always pick just one vendor. Maybe it's, it's Syngistics for one person, it's Rest Assured for another, it's Safe and Home for another, it's Simply Home for some people. You don't have to pick just one. And then evaluate and choose for that person. So it should be a person by person choice on who that vendor is. Here are some things that you may want to consider asking. We talked about this a little bit before, asking vendors as you're evaluating them. And I'm going to kind of pause there to see if there are any other questions. I do see some things in the chat. So in Missouri, remote supports are, this is in the chat. In Missouri, remote supports are reviewed by a Human Rights Committee prior to funding. Is this true in other areas? Yes and no, Chris, thanks for the question. Great question. I have seen many states like Missouri that do require HRC review, but there are also many states that don't require that. It's just a team decision, and as long as it's documented in the ISP that there's informed consent, in place and team consent, then it's allowed and it doesn't have to go through Human Rights Committee review. Minnesota is one of those states that is kind of like that, where they don't require HRC review unless there is a camera used in an area that is deemed private. So, maybe the team is saying, hey, we need a camera in this bedroom because he has to have the CPAP on his face all night and it's a health and safety issue. And he would rather have that than having a staff person sitting next to him, or checking in on him every hour. So in those situations, I do see it escalating to HRC review. Any other questions from anybody? Okay. Well, we do have a few more minutes. Let's try to get through section 2, and then maybe we're going to have to do a follow-up session on this if we really want to get through this. So one of the weird things for provider agencies, and this is going to be different state to state, but one of the weird things for provider agencies is if you this whole subcontract with a remote support vendor, or is the remote support vendor going to be taking hours of service away from the local provider? In Ohio, as an example, they have funding mechanisms for both of those scenarios. They have a funding mechanism that where the remote support vendor, if they're a certified waiver provider in that state, they bill the waiver directly for those hours of service. The local service provider is not involved in any way with that in that situation. But they also have a rate that if that local provider provides a backup person, then the remote support vendor becomes a subcontractor to that local provider, providing the remote supports on their behalf, but the local provider then bills the waiver. So I've seen it done both of those ways in various states. So a tricky thing there, especially in the team setting, and which is why I said we need to be talking about everybody's needs and goals, including the provider and family and case manager and all that, is that in those states where you are required to subcontract with a local with the remote support vendor, and the remote support vendor is not billing the waiver directly, you have to enter into a contractual relationship with that remote support vendor, and the team is telling you as an agency which vendor you have to contract with. So that's a little kind of a weird area for you as a provider agency that you'll have to kind of dance around pretty carefully. Most of the time, the contract language is not going to be something that you would be opposed to, but it's your agency. You should have the right to be able to contract with whomever you want, but also the individual should be able to pick whichever remote support vendor is appropriate for them. So if you're in a state like that, just it's a strange area that you might get into. So for you as an agency, I would really, and this is kind of mirroring what we talk about in Shift, setting agency goals for those agencies, for those of you that are going through Shift Tech First accreditation. It's a big piece of what we're doing there is writing an agency tech plan where you would be setting goals. You, in the process of going through Shift, you are kind of forming a tech team because you have a leadership person, you've got a couple of ETISs, you've got DSPs that are doing this. So those ETISs and your leadership person are kind of the start of your tech team, but whom else could you bring in outside of those people? I would definitely include some of the people that you're serving in that tech team, some family members, maybe IT, obviously maybe some frontline supervisors as well. So there's also many policies and procedures that if you're providing remote support that you're going to need to consider and have in place before you should really begin, such as your policy on consent. You could probably copy and paste that from your current one, how you do it in a person-centered planning way, those kinds of things that you're going to need to have in place. Backup policy, backup responder policies, internet failure policies or system failure policies, stuff that you guys just have to think through and put in writing as kind of agency standards on how we should do this. And here are some of the things that I thought that you should kind of be looking at as a provider agency in policies that you should need to kind of start putting some framework around. And these things could be included in your tech plan as a part of Shift. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm about ready to lose my voice. But there are several other sections. We have a section on implementation and ongoing support that we didn't get to, unfortunately. I apologize. I knew I wouldn't get through the whole thing because it's meant to be about a 2 to 3 hour presentation. Any questions before we jump off today? Let's check the chat again. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it. So yeah, this recording will be put inside of Shift here soon as a supplemental learning. I'll probably go ahead and try to finish out the rest of the session so that it's not stopped here in the middle of the deck. But and then also the file that the presentation that we've been going through will be attached in there. So look for that. Also look forward next month's session. And yeah, always feel free to reach out to either myself or Cameron Kempson with any questions that you have about Shift or remote supports for that fact. So thank you all for your time. Thanks for being a part of this. And I'll kind of pause to see if there are any other questions. Otherwise, I think we'll call it a day. All right. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thanks for the kind words in the chat. Talk to you all soon.